IVM.
Yuddha is for adults. It contains graphic depictions of violence against humans and animals. If you feel you'll be triggered by the accounts of violence in this podcast, it's best you skip through those bits. That said, on to the episode.
The Deccan, January 23rd, 1565. More than 500 years after the Battle of Koppam, where we started this season. The massive army of Ramaraya, ruler of Vijayanagara, slowly advances towards the armies of the Deccan Sultanates. Within a few hours, the history of southern India will never be the same again. What do we see as we hover over this early modern Deccan battlefield? A lot of things would have been recognizable to those long-forgotten Chola and Chalukya kings with whom we started this season. There are still tens of thousands of infantrymen, clad in little more than a loincloth, holding shields, spears, swords, and maces. There are still mighty elephants, many covered in plates of armor, pointed flags fluttering on their backs, their trunks wielding chains and swords. There are still kings on both sides seated on elephants, shielded from the harsh Deccan sun by gorgeous parasols, surrounded by their vassals and fellow warlords and their retinues. Advancing from the north, we see Hussain Nizam Shah, Sultan of Ahmednagar, a determined and embittered man with a pale face covered in stubble, wearing a small red turban and a flowing white robe with a red sash. Not far away from him is Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah, Sultan of Golconda, a somewhat rotund young man with a carefully dressed beard. Both men are nervous. They know that they are facing the most powerful army in South India, and they both distrust and fear each other almost as much as they fear their opponents. Today, they have two daring tactics to employ to level the odds. If we look a little distance to the west, we will see the first of those tactics, something that would have been a little unfamiliar to those Chola and Chalukya kings of over 500 years ago. This is a massive army of armored cavalrymen, clad in bright steel and bronze, wearing plumed helmets, led by Ali Adil Shah, Sultan of Bijapur, a handsome, bronze-skinned man with a flowing black beard. His force crossed the Krishna River the previous night and is now deployed along the Vijayanagara army's left flank. Ramaraya, ruler of Vijayanagara, the most powerful man in South India, is confident of victory. His golden skin shines under his tall Persian hat, made of blue silk with gold brocade, covered in a saffron robe decorated with gold, sheltered from the sun by a bright red imperial parasol and a fluttering banner on which the ancient boar crest of the Chalukyas dances. To him, these sultans are little more than unruly vassals. His army is not that different from the sultans. In fact, if not for the banners that each side flies, you might not even be able to tell them apart. Both sides have thousands of armored horses. Both sides have swift cavalry archers. Both sides have soldiers from Central Asia and Iran as well as South Asia. Both sides have soldiers who worship Shiva and Vishnu and Allah. The military aristocrats who command both armies know each other well and are bound by ties of patronage and by ties of blood. In some ways, the Deccan has changed beyond all recognition. In many others, it has not. Drums and horns begin to blow on both sides. It is time for the cities of victory to meet their destinies. Welcome to Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast. I'm Anirudh Kanesetti.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan. We've seen over the last two episodes how the Bahmani Sultanate and Vijayanagara sparred against each other, how the Bahmani Sultanate began to disintegrate, and how, even as the Bahmani Sultanate fell apart, a new power, the Portuguese, came to the Arabian Sea, how the Portuguese captured Goa and dominated the sea-based trade in war horses. Through these episodes, we've often looked at the big picture, the vast impersonal forces that shape the world. In this episode, we're going to return to the individuals that shaped India in the 16th century. From brilliant, embittered sultans to overconfident Rayas to awestruck Portuguese to the soldiers in the forts and on the battlefields. We'll begin with one of the most remarkable rulers of Vijayanagara, Krishnadevaraya, and see how his decisions shaped the grand strategy of this gunpowder-wielding South Indian empire at its peak. Through this story, we'll also start to see glimpses of a military revolution that began to unfold in the Deccan as the Sultanates began to invest in arguably the most sophisticated artillery to be found anywhere in the world. Then, on the chessboard of Deccan politics that unfolded after Krishnadevaraya's death, we'll see his successors make the moves that would one day end in the final clash of the cities of victory.
So we come at last to Krishnadevaraya, arguably one of the most famous of all Indian kings and easily as decisive and as important to the history of the subcontinent as his contemporary Henry VIII of England. And now Krishnadevaraya is, I personally think, a very misunderstood character. Very often he's kind of portrayed as this ideal king who is so kind and so benevolent to his subjects. You know, the poet king and great conqueror that is sung of in Indian ballads and poetry. But the real man is really far more complex than that. And to really understand who Krishnadevaraya was, it's necessary to kind of get a little further back into the history of Vijayanagara. Now, over the course of the 15th century, which is broadly the century before Krishnadevaraya's time, the period when, as we saw in the last episode, the Chinese were beginning to enter the Indian Ocean, there were a number of devastating famines that struck the Deccan in 1412, 1423, 1471, and these led, as you can imagine, to a reduction of populations, to declining harvests, to falling land revenues, and just generally an overall loss of dynamism in the Deccan economy. Now, if you recall the first episode that we did on the cities of victory, we talked a lot about how Vijayanagara, this kind of upland state in the arid Deccan, had a lot of difficulties keeping control over its more fertile and wealthy trading regions, and not just the western Kannada coast, but especially the eastern Coromandel coast. And we also saw in the first episode of the series how an ambitious general, Salva Narasimha Nayaka, basically built up the Coromandel into his personal power base, repelled invasions from the Gajapatis of Orissa, and eventually overthrew the Sangamas, the founding dynasty of Vijayanagara, and eventually became emperor. Now, as you might imagine, Narasimha Nayaka was not alone in being an ambitious military man in the Vijayanagara aristocracy. His bid for the throne was supported by two other very famous generals, the first being Aravedi Bukka and the second being the man who would eventually become the father of the Emperor Krishnadevaraya. Now, Krishnadevaraya was not really supposed to be on the throne, if oral histories are any indication. He was the younger son of this ambitious Tuluva general. His father had been made the regent of Salva Narasimha's young son, and as you can imagine, the man overthrew the child and installed his elder son, Krishnadevaraya's elder half-brother, Veera Narasimha, as the emperor. Now, Krishnadevaraya's brother seemed to be having a fairly easy go of it when he first came to the throne. A number of other military aristocrats in the Vijayanagara Empire began to kind of set out on their own imperial ambitions. They were brutally crushed by Veera Narasimha, but the man died before his time, which eventually led to his younger half-brother, Krishnadevaraya, coming to the throne. As you can imagine, all this kind of turmoil in the Vijayanagara center was accompanied with the rise of a host of new challenges further away from the imperial heartland. To the northwest, you have all these new sultanates, which we talked about in the last episode, and also briefly touched upon in the first episode of the series. Especially the Sultanate of Bijapur was going to prove to be his greatest challenge, because both of these cities of victory, Bijapur and Vijayanagara, clashed over the fertile frontier region of the Raichu Deva. On the northeast of the Vijayanagara dominions were the Gajapatis of Orissa, who were always sensitive to any change in the power dynamics between the Deccan, South India and Orissa. They had noticed that Vijayanagara central authority was on the decline and therefore had begun to renew their excursions down the east coast. And possibly the most devastating of all the threats that the Vijayanagara Empire was facing at this time were the chiefs of southern Karnataka, especially the chiefs of Ummattur. The chieftains of Ummattur were based around broadly modern Mysore, Srirangapatna, Shivanasamudra, and these guys were not okay with the Tuluva family, namely Krishnadevaraya's family's usurpation of the throne. So they had basically set out on their own attempt to seize power, and they were rapidly expanding across the peninsula, heading east broadly, following the course of the Krishna River. And this was an existential threat to Vijayanagara, because it would have meant that the great city would have been cut off from the Tamil dominions, namely the Coromandel coast, which provided a great amount of food and income to the empire. Now, Krishnadevaraya, despite the fact that he had hardly come to the throne under the most auspicious of circumstances, proved himself to be extraordinarily militarily capable. Really his father's son in a lot of ways. In 1509, Krishnadevaraya defeated the Adil Shah, supposedly actually killing the Adil Shah in the engagement. Soon after, he headed south and savagely defeated the Umattur chiefs. His invasion was in fact so savage that it created a power vacuum in the region that eventually led to the rise of a minor dynasty called the Odayars, which means chieftains. These chiefs would eventually become the famous Wadayars of Mysore. Then in 1513, Krishnadevaraya began to head up the east coast. He conquered the fort of Udaygiri, which was at that point a Gajapati stronghold. Udaygiri had previously been conquered by Salava Narasimha Nayaka, who eventually became the emperor. But as I mentioned before, the Gajapatis had noticed that there was weakness in Vijayanagara and therefore had kind of gone back and seized it. Soon after that, he conquered most of the Krishna Delta from them. He then sacked Vijayawada and Kondapalli and finally captured Rajamandri. And by 1520, Krishnadevaraya was indisputably one of the most powerful monarchs of southern India. Now, the reasons for his success are manifold, and they're not just down to military brilliance. Krishnadevaraya is one of those enigmatic figures who seems to be so far ahead of their times. This man was able to straddle both the ancient and the medieval world and our modern world with absolute ease. This is the kind of man that you would have seen sipping from a Chinese porcelain vessel, wearing the high fashion of Timurid Central Asia while listening to Sanskrit and Telugu court poetry. And the kind of political strategy that he adopted to keep his control over this highly diverse empire also kind of reflects his own modernism and globalism, if I can use that term. And now, what he did to increase his power, arguably more than any Vijayanagara emperor before or after him, was this novel strategy where all these unruly chiefs of Karnataka were kind of constrained from above, as the American historian Burton Stein puts it, by creating a system of royal fortresses under Brahmin commanders. These gentlemen held the title of Durga Dandanayaka, and these Brahmin commanders had under them troops who were Portuguese, who were Muslims, who were basically people who were proficient in the use of artillery, of musketry. And Krishnadevaraya also used a large number of people who were kind of recruited from the Adivasi communities of southern India. So what this system basically did was, by centralizing military authority in the hands of people who were directly loyal to the emperor. These Brahmin commanders, keep in mind, didn't come from traditional military backgrounds in general. They had no kind of power base of their own. They did not have lands of their own. And they had to be loyal purely to the emperor in order to maintain their position. So these guys were basically used to make sure that these warlike chiefs, especially chieftains of Umattur, were not able to raise too many armies, raise taxes, and go about doing their own business without being answerable to the emperor. But that's not all. Krishnadevaraya also created a new class of military aristocracy called the Polygars. The Polygars came from very often Tamil and Telugu families. They began to come into existence as military servants, if you can use that term, basically keepers of the forts that Krishnadevaraya built and staffed with his loyalists. And by controlling these warrior households, by using agents who are loyal to him, and by creating a totally new class of minor chiefs who are dependent on him, Krishnadevaraya was able to kind of channelize and capture the resources of the Deccan that had never really been done before. As a result of which you see these kind of extraordinary military successes that I outlined above. But that isn't all. Krishnadevaraya was also most remarkable perhaps because he took the policy that his predecessor Devaraya II had begun and kind of extended it to its logical conclusion. Devaraya II, as we mentioned in the first episode of Cities of Victory, had begun to recruit large numbers of Turkic or just generally foreign cavalrymen, and he also began to aggressively kind of import horses. By Krishnadevaraya's time, because the Portuguese had taken over Goa, they were in a position to supply much, much larger numbers of horses to the Deccan and to Vijayanagara. We have outlined broadly how this policy worked in our last episode, and to kind of understand really just how important this foreign trade was to securing this crucial military resource, we spoke to Srinivas Reddy, who is the author of an unprecedented biography of Krishnadevaraya. It's called Raya, Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara, and it's available on Amazon and wherever you get your books. And this is what Srinivas had to say.
Merchants from distant lands who import elephants and war horses should be kept in imperial service at the capital. Treat them with prestige and provide them with towns and mansions. Purchase their goods at a high price and ensure that your enemies are deprived of such resources. This is verse from 4th chapter, verse 258 of the Amuktamalila of Krishnadevaraya. It's a fantastic verse on many levels, and in one, just beautiful passage captures a lot of the political and military and diplomatic issues going on at the time. So we have merchants from distant lands who are importing these war horses. These are the Portuguese in particular at this time. Should be kept in imperial service at the capital. Okay, in the capital city, that is Vijayanagara. Treat them with prestige and provide them with towns and mansions. Now, this is exactly what we read in Pius's account when he was invited to go to the court along with the musketeer general Christopher Figueiredo. And here's what he says. This is what Pius says. He, Krishnadevaraya, commanded us to be lodged in some very good houses. And Figueiredo was visited by many lords and captains. The king said many kind and pleasant things to him and asked him concerning the kind of state which the king of Portugal kept up, and having been told about it, he seemed much pleased. And they brought them all sorts of gifts and nice things. So the point is that they were lavishly treated, just as the verse suggests. The last line is even more interesting. It says, purchase their goods at a high price and assure that your enemies are deprived of such resources. This is exactly a pointed, remark in regard to the military and economic policy that Krishnadevaraya had vis-a-vis the horse import. And really the horse, as we've discussed, is the most important military item in the Deccan warfare scene at this time. And so the Portuguese are importing these horses, and they create a bidding war between Bijapur and Vijayanagara, intentionally, of course. And this is Raya's solution to that is simply outbid people. And that's what he did, and that's how he got the horses, and that's one of the reasons he was so successful in battle. Here's another verse now, more poetic in nature, but also has direct references to horses, and particularly war horses, military war horses imported from Central and Western Asia. It goes like this. Soldiers need 2 stirrups to mount their tall stallions. But as the horses gallops and begins to crouch, their riders become scared as their feet graze the ground. Which of these 2 is worse, and what becomes of us? Think the proud warriors as they feign exhaustion, humbled twice over by these mighty swift steeds from Persia, Balkh, Herat, and Khotan. So here at the very end of the line, you see the direct mention in the verses of these different lands, like Khotinese horses, Herat, Persia by name. So the historical aspect is important there. Now, the metaphor, and this gets into more the poetic imagination of the great king, is telling this story. The whole idea now is a beautiful metaphor of the tall stallion when it's standing, and then how it crouches down to increase its speed when it's galloping. And how in both instances, these warriors are kind of being humbled by this great stallion. Once because they need 2 stirrups to even get on and mount this great beast. So they feel short. But then when the horses are galloping, they start crouching down, and then these guys, are almost hitting their feet on the ground, and so they're getting scared that they might, get messed up and fall off. And then they start asking, which of these 2 fates is worse for us? And really, it is all in praise of these incredible animals that became the centerpiece of Deccan warfare in the 16th century.
The success of this policy was so remarkable that even foreign visitors to Vijayanagara actually remarked upon it. I have with me two quotes from these Portuguese merchants that Srinivas talked about, and they go like this. The horsemen were dressed in quilted tunics, two also of brocade and velvet and every kind of silk. These tunics are made of layers of very strong raw leather and furnished with other iron plates that make them strong. Some have these plates gilded both inside and out, and some are made of silver. Their headpieces are in the manner of helmets with borders covering the neck, and each has its piece to protect the face. They are of the same fashion as the tunics. This description of heavy cavalry armor would correspond very well to the kind of armored Muslim aristocratic cavalrymen that you would have seen in any of the Deccan Sultanates to Vijayanagara's north, and that we also mentioned in our episodes about the Delhi Sultanate earlier in this season. But perhaps what is most remarkable about Vijayanagara is how much it departs from the old formula of Indian kingship, where sovereignty is associated primarily with the elephant. By the Vijayanagara period, it really seems like the horse had come into its own as a royal vehicle. In fact, Srinivas has a fascinating paper, which we'll mention in our show notes once they go up, where he talks about how maintaining control of the cavalry supply, maintaining control of the supply of horses, was a sign of royal power and of royal wealth. To be able to field a large force of cavalry and to be able to display it in public in all these expensive maneuvers and in public rituals was integral to Krishnadevaraya exhibiting and intimidating the other chiefs under him by showing the kind of army that he had at his disposal. Here's an example of a Portuguese eyewitness who saw the great Mahanavami festival at Vijayanagara, which would have seen Krishnadevaraya leaving his palace, advancing to arguably one of the most famous monuments at the ruins of Vijayanagara, Hampi today, namely the Mahanavami Deva, which is this gigantic ceremonial platform with a granite core which eventually had layers of schist added onto it, which are carved with various depictions of people bringing the king tribute, displaying the king in various martial poses, showing the military strength of the Vijayanagara kings. This gigantic platform would have had a wooden superstructure on top, which probably contained a shrine to the tutelary goddess of the Vijayanagara Empire. And every year during the Mahanavami festival, the nobility of the city and of the empire at large would all gather here to worship the goddess, to consecrate their weapons, and to receive the accounts and the tribute of various chiefs. Now, in this supremely important festival, which arguably represents the very core of Vijayanagara power and ritual, this is what the Portuguese eyewitness had to say. The king leaves his palace riding on the horses of which I have already told you, clothed in the many rich white cloths I have mentioned, with two umbrellas of state, all gilded and covered with crimson velvet. Then to see the grandeur of the nobles and men of rank, I cannot possibly describe it all, nor should I be believed if I tried to do so. Then to see the horses and the armor that they wear, you would see them so covered with metal plates that I have no words to express what I saw. So very clearly what the Portuguese visitor is seeing is the displacement almost of the elephant as the archetypal symbol of royal power and of military power and of martial and virile strength by the horse. And that should really give you a hint of how Krishnadevaraya's military tactics really worked. But we'll come to that in a little bit.
This brings us to the 5 Deccan Sultanates, which by now were already developing their own idea of what cutting-edge weaponry looks like. But before we get to that weaponry, let's try and get a sense of what these 5 sultanates were. If you think of the peninsula of India as an ice cream cone, these 5 sultanates together were sprawled over a large landmass somewhere in the middle of this ice cream cone, just before it reaches its broadest extent. Their boundaries were not necessarily natural ones you'd expect, like rivers or mountain ranges. Actually, on a map, these sultanates would look a lot like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitted together with protruding slivers of territory sandwiched between other states. So let's just imagine a map and go clockwise, from west to east, starting at the 9 o'clock position with Bijapur, which until 1510 also included Goa at its southwestmost extreme. Moving to the 10 or 11 o'clock position, you'd have Ahmednagar, then would come Berar at the 1 or 2 o'clock position, and Golconda at 3 o'clock. Now that's 4 sultanates, but there's also a 5th one, Bidar, which is right at the center of this imagined clock of ours. Now, to the south of these sultanates lay the vast expanse of Vijayanagara. And in between Vijayanagara and the five sultanates, as Anirudh mentioned, was the frontier zone that repeatedly changed hands. This was, of course, the area dominated by the Raichur Doab, the fertile triangular spit of land between the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers. By the early 16th century, both Vijayanagara and the Deccan Sultanates were experts at using cavalry, both horse archers and heavy shock cavalry. They were also adept at using siege engines like trebuchets that would hurl stones at fort walls or at besieging troops. But a new class of weapons systems had by this time already begun entering peninsular India. These were, of course, artillery and firearms. In our last episode, listeners might recall the Portuguese had encountered cannons along the western coast, whether at Kozhikode or at Goa. Now, where did these cannons come from? Our best guess is that the initial instances came from Mameluke Egypt. Early examples of these cannons that are found in India bear close resemblance to those from Egypt. We also know that the Bahmani sultans had close trade ties with the Mamelukes, and Indian textiles and spices could easily buy all the firearms you wanted. It's also clear that by the early 16th century, cannons were also being made in India. Initially, this was likely with the help of Mameluke engineers, but local production and innovations quickly took off. Now, when the Portuguese took Goa from the Bijapuri sultans in 1510, they were startled to find not only Portuguese cannons, which had been captured 2 years earlier at the Battle of Chol, but also other cannons, gunpowder, and equipment for casting and shaping a lot more cannons. This is clear evidence of the sort of cannon production capability that was being developed in the Deccan, especially by the Bijapuris. Over the years that followed, captured Portuguese weapons, as well as engineers from Europe who were looking for employment, would infuse their own new technologies and new ideas into this existing Deccan tradition of cannon manufacture, as well as in the manufacture of matchlock muskets. In fact, one of the leading experts of firearms in this period, Rainer Deinhardt, says that this created a new hybrid Indo-Portuguese class of matchlock muskets, and that these muskets would be used not just by the Portuguese in Goa, but by Vijayanagara, the Sultanates, and they were also exported further afield by the Portuguese as far away as Japan. And this new class of Indo-Portuguese weapons incorporated not just new ideas from European engineers, but also from Deccan engineers and from the Deccan tradition of cannon making from materials found in India. And this resulted in really some of the best cannons and some of the best matchlock muskets anywhere in the world. In fact, Afonso de Albuquerque, the man who captured Goa, would write back to Portugal saying that the firearms and the cannons found in India were actually as good as the ones found in Bohemia. And just for context, Bohemia and the Germanies were at this time at the heart of European cannon manufacture. These were the places where some of the best cannons were made. So at this time, the Deccan was not just passively receiving technology from others and incorporating it or implementing it. They were actually creating some of the best cannons anywhere in the world. Now, what did this mean for the Bijapuris? Well, Ismail Adil Shah decided it was time to teach Vijayanagara a lesson. And so he acquired a large number of cannons. From the evidence we have, there were at least 400 large cannons and perhaps another 500 smaller ones. These cannons were intended to be used on a battlefield, and he would take an army all the way to the Krishna River, ready to fight Krishnadevaraya in the Raichur Doab. Incidentally, the Bijapuris had also fortified the town of Raichur itself, not just with the usual counterweight trebuchets and so on, but also with some cannon. So firearms are going to be at the heart of Ismail Adil Shah's new ambitions.
And so it was that possibly one of the 16th century's most important battles was fought, the Battle of Raichur in 1520. It initially started very, very well indeed for Ismail Adil Shah. Ismail very quickly ordered his army to cross the river before the Vijayanagara forces could defend it. And he managed to line his cannons all up in front of his army and set off a devastating volley. Now, it does not seem that Krishnadevaraya was expecting something to happen so quickly. We are told that in the matter of just a few minutes, a very large amount of his center, which were mostly made up of lightly armed infantry, were absolutely decimated by the cannons. And just imagine what it would have been like for a soldier who's advancing in a Vijayanagara army, right? The infantrymen were generally recruited, as I mentioned before, from forest peoples, or they would have been pulled up from levies in various villages, or made up the retinues and men-at-arms of like various feudal lords of of the Vijayanagara state, and there would of course have been some mercenaries, but none of these guys would have been trained or inured to receiving cannon fire, to having these massive balls of stone or metal flying at hundreds of kilometers an hour, slamming into the ground in front of you or onto you, blowing up you and your companions in this massive bang of sound and heat that would have been absolutely terrifying, even if you had been trained to actually face these head on. And as you can imagine, it very nearly led to a rout. But at that point, we are told that Krishnadevaraya noticed a fatal weakness. The cannons took ages to actually reload. The Bijapuri forces were still busy reloading the cannons when Krishnadevaraya, who once again very significantly does not seem to have been seated on an elephant but on a horse, began to rally his personal imperial guard around him, all of whom appear to have been very heavily armed cavalry, and charged straight at the cannons of the Bijapur side, which, as we recall, were deployed at the front of their army. And it was absolutely devastating. This cavalry absolutely steamrollered the people who were operating the cannons before they could get off another shot. They managed to get behind the cannons and in fact reach the front lines of the Bijapuri army, which were made up mostly of archers and other light infantry, and began to slice through them like a hot knife through butter. This was absolutely terrifying to the Bijapuris, who had by all accounts advanced into this battle with every expectation of an easy victory. They very quickly began to retreat, and this retreat turned into a full-on rout. As I mentioned earlier, Ismail Adil Shah had crossed the Krishna River in order to fight this battle. Now he gave the order for a general retreat, and his men began to leap into the water without any care for their lives in an absolute panic and try to swim across. At this point, the Vijayanagara army rallied once again. A lot of this light infantry, especially archers, came up to the banks of the river and began to shoot into these slow-moving Bijapuri forces at point-blank range, leading to an absolute slaughter. Ismail Adil Shah was forced to leave most of his artillery behind. We are told that he just barely managed to save himself by getting onto an elephant and fleeing, and that was it. Within the space of just a few hours, it seemed that Krishnadevaraya had proved that this newfangled technology from across the seas wasn't all that it was built up to be, and that all that really mattered in the Deccan was to have a really good cavalry force. This initial impression was further reinforced by the siege of the Citadel of Raichu that eventually followed. This citadel was in Bijapuri hands, and Krishnadevaraya had previously made an unsuccessful attempt to capture it, but now that Ismail Adil Shah had been decisively driven away, was able to return and try to capture it again. Aditya mentioned a little earlier how both trebuchets and cannon were being deployed on fortifications at the same time at this point of time, and that's a very interesting point, because it kind of shows that despite the introduction of this new technology, the old ways, the well-tested ways of siege warfare was still much better understood in terms of their tactical utility. Now, most of what we know from this campaign is admittedly from a biased source, namely a bunch of Portuguese who just happened to apparently walk into these decisive battles and turn the tide of the campaigns in Krishnadevaraya's favor. According to the Portuguese, what happened was that Krishnadevaraya basically didn't even bother trying to build any kind of siege engines, and basically just ordered his men to run pell-mell at the walls and kind of break the walls apart with pickaxes. This might seem like an absolutely foolhardy and callous thing to do, and perhaps it is in a way. Krishnadevaraya, even though he was admittedly the grandson of a peasant and the son of a general, does not really seem to have been the type who cared an awful lot for how many of his men died. I mentioned a little earlier his siege against Orissa. His capture of the fort of Udaygiri is also supposed to have dragged on for an excruciatingly long number of time and exposed his men to all kinds of trials and tribulations in terms of disease and all kinds of poor hygiene. So that again kind of reveals that Krishnadevaraya is not really the ideal king that he's very often thought of as. So on the one hand, you have that. It's certainly possible that Krishnadevaraya didn't particularly care about these low-born peasants who were basically the rabble that made up most of his army. But there's also a bit of a tactical point to this. According to some indications, the cannons that were on the walls of the fortress of Raichur at this time weren't actually capable of maneuvering. They couldn't really change the angle of the cannon up and down, which means that they had a very limited kind of zone of fire. They could only hit up to a particular point, but beyond that point and within that kind of zone of fire, they were almost totally ineffective. So the Vijayanagara troops are actually able to get in pretty damn close and try to dismantle the walls. But despite the overwhelming advantage in terms of numbers that Krishnadevaraya had, the Portuguese tell us that this absolutely didn't work. The Bijapuris would simply rebuild any fortifications that came apart, and they were so cocky that their commander would happily walk about on the walls with no fear of being attacked. But the Portuguese, of course, had much more sophisticated handheld weaponry, namely the arquebus, and supposedly managed to snipe the commander of the fort from far away. They very soon whittled down the numbers of the fort's defenders and caused their morale to drop drastically, at which point the fort peacefully surrendered to Krishnadevaraya and was well treated. Once again, as biased as this may be, the Portuguese giving themselves far too much credit perhaps, we once again see that artillery might not have seemed like the best investment for Krishnadevaraya. From his point of view, an army with a very large amount of infantry and a highly disciplined, highly effective shock cavalry was more than capable of outmaneuvering and of overpowering this new technology. And as a result, he came away from the 1520 campaign with a decided streak of overconfidence and even, dare I say it, arrogance. Ismail Adil Shah requested that the fort be given back to him. Krishnadevaraya supposedly said that he would gladly return it to him if only Ismail Adil Shah would come and kiss his foot. Kissing one's foot might seem like a terribly ill-mannered thing to demand in our modern body culture. But to the medieval Deccani mind, touching and worshipping the feet of a superior was really not that much out of the question. It does not seem to have been something that the Deccan Sultanates extensively did, but it would have been fairly par for the course in southern India at the time. Of course, Ismail Adil Shah refused to lower himself to doing any such thing and claimed that he could not leave his capital because of pressing concerns, at which point Krishnadevaraya is supposed to have replied that he would not inconvenience Ismail and would actually come and present his feet to him himself, so Ismail could pay obeisance to him in person, which was basically an excuse for yet another campaign. So over the course of 1523, Krishnadevaraya once again penetrates deep into the northern Deccan, this time perhaps further than any Vijayanagara monarch has ever done before. He actually encamps outside Bijapur. He sacks and burns a large number of palaces of the nobles. But beyond that, doesn't really do too much. He's realized that he's kind of made his point. He also, during the course of this campaign, reaches Gulbarga, the former capital of the Bahmani Sultanate, and there he supposedly captured one of the sons of the long since deposed last Bahmani Sultan and declared that this man was the new Sultan of the Deccan, at which point he claimed for himself the title of Yavanarajya Sthapanacharya, which means the great guru who has established the Yavana kingdom. Think about it. It really says a lot about the way that Krishnadevaraya thinks of the northern Deccan. He very much clearly thinks of it as a land that is supposed to be ruled by Yavanas, this different ethnicity from him. And in fact, he takes pride in actually establishing a Yavana king there, because as far as he's concerned, it really only shows his glory and his power and his control over this distant territory. Once again, this really kind of brings into question this picture that many people have of Krishnadevaraya as this avenging kind of Hindu dharmic king. He's really not. He's really a far more complex and difficult to understand character than that. But anyway, Krishnadevaraya, after this 1523 campaign, returns back to Vijayanagara, totally convinced in the benefits of cavalry. And with all the wealth that he's captured from these extraordinarily successful campaigns, from his increasingly tight revenue apparatus, in fact, in 1522, he made a campaign to the western coast of India, namely the Konkan coast, which was under Vijayanagara control. And he's supposed to have tried to defeat a number of chiefs there, but failed to kind of really establish a revenue apparatus of his own. As we talked about in the previous episode, these coastal polities were very kind of independent and unruly and would not really accept foreign rule, and had a lot of money that they were personally making from the foreign trade, and Krishnadevaraya was not totally successful in managing to get them to pay him permanent tribute, but clearly managed to get some kind of revenues out of it, and so returned to his capital in triumph. This inaugurated arguably one of the most extraordinary periods of metropolitan growth that India has ever seen. In the 16th century, Vijayanagara's size grew to such an extent that it was possibly one of, if not the largest cities in the world, with a population of over 300,000 40,000 at a time when the population of Paris or London would have barely been 30 or 40,000. 300,000 people is not a small number. It's a massive, massive number of people. And the city, as you can imagine, grew at a massive pace in order to kind of accommodate all these new people that were beginning to come in search for commercial opportunity, in search for wealth. And this meant that a lot of the former suburbs and villages that once produced food for the city was swallowed up in this sprawling megalopolis, as the archaeologist Kathleen Morrison calls it, in a way that's obviously very reminiscent of the way that modern Indian cities grow. Krishnadevaraya also embarked on a series of remarkable construction projects. He built a great number of very capital-intensive waterworks, massive reservoirs. The modern town of Hospet, which is Hampi's link with most of the outside world, it really became an important suburb of Vijayanagara during Krishnadevaraya's time. He is also responsible for a spurt of temple-building activity, especially the remarkable Vithala temple, which you can still see in Hampi today. And a number of other temples began to grow around in the sacred center as Krishnadevaraya's generals and his vassals began to try and build these monuments to not just to gods but also to their own personal political power. These temples very often had massive marketplaces around them and therefore acted as very important kind of loci of consumption and of the redistribution of foodstuffs and of commerce of all sorts. The descriptions that we have from the Portuguese visitors to Vijayanagara at this time are truly, truly breathtaking, and it's very clear that these men who had come from the other side of the world, from impoverished, backward Europe, had never seen a city of this kind of size, this kind of density. We have these lavish descriptions of Krishnadevaraya's palace with these satin and silk and beds with like this elaborately carved teak gilded with gold, with jewelry and beds everywhere. They supposedly saw these spectacular murals that depicted the goings-on of the city, which were meant to be seen by the queens who otherwise were not allowed into public. And supposedly among these murals included some paintings of Portuguese as well. So clearly there's a great deal of dynamism and activity that's happening in Vijayanagara at this time. Very interestingly, if you look at the Vithala temple, which Krishnadevaraya built after a lot of these campaigns, it tells us a great deal about the way that this extraordinary man really saw himself. The walls of the temple actually have carvings of Portuguese men bringing horses to the emperor. And that might seem a little extraordinary, these depictions of foreigners on a temple, which to our modern minds we very often think of as these purely religious structures, might seem surprising, but to Krishnadevaraya, it was no more, no less than an expression of his modernity, his cosmopolitanism. The famous stone chariot that many of us associate with Hampi today, which is now pulled by 2 elephants, was originally pulled by 2 horses, which were lost later on, but we'll come to that a little later. And the reason why Krishnadevaraya chose to build the stone chariot in front of his Vithala temple and have horses pulling it was to try and really indicate that he had triumphed over the kingdoms that had formerly had the most effective cavalry in the entire subcontinent, namely the Deccan Sultanates. Most interestingly, the Vithala temple is dedicated to the god Vithala of Pandharpur, which is in Maharashtra. It's a northern Deccan form of Krishna. For him to be replicated here south of the Tungabhadra river is, I think, once again an indication of Krishnadevaraya's kind of vision and kind of his intent to project his influence and his power deep into the northern Deccan. So it really is a most remarkable time for Vijayanagara. Now, as you can imagine, being an ascendant superpower, the Vijayanagara military elite is supremely confident. They don't really see a need to invest in further defenses because they figured out something that they think is going to be absolutely foolproof and hold up against any kind of Sultanate attack. They pioneer this new system of curtain walls where all their border fortresses are kind of surrounded by walls that extend far away from the main settlement itself. The French archaeologist Nicolas Morel has written about this, and he basically shows through a survey of the fort of Torgal, which is one of these frontier forts that I was talking about. These curtain walls are basically intended to kind of force Sultanate artillery to keep kind of pausing to break them down. And when they stop to break them down, the idea is that Vijayanagara cavalry will kind of maneuver very rapidly through these walls, come in, swoop in, take out the artillerymen and kind of swoop back, therefore totally incapacitating them. We don't see the exact same thing in the city of Vijayanagara itself, but in the minds of the Vijayanagara elite, the city didn't really even need any sort of protection like that. For nearly 300 250 square kilometers away from the city itself, you had these systems of smaller forts which were very deliberately placed on these hillocks, which would have been able to communicate with each other through a system of flags or perhaps smoke signals, and also kind of commanded crucial strategic entry points to this broader Vijayanagara metropolitan region. You also see the development of earthworks. You see that basically ditches are dug in various areas, and the earth that comes out of these ditches is used to basically build up small earthen ramparts. Little rocks that are found in the area are kind of stacked together and embedded in these walls to create these artificial kind of funnel points which enemies will be forced to move through. You also see the development of these fascinating things called horse stones. Now, horse stones are basically these small sharp stones that are laid out in fields near these strategic entry routes to the city. The Vijayanagara cavalry would have known how to navigate through these fields of stones in a relatively safe way, whereas the enemy cavalry would have had to kind of push through them, therefore injuring the hooves of their horses and totally incapacitating them. So as far as Vijayanagara was concerned, there wasn't really too much that they had to do. The city itself was fortified by some of the most impressive walls that still exist in India today. They are made of these gigantic stone blocks which are carved quite literally like jigsaw pieces and assembled in a way that they're extraordinarily kind of seismically stable and are very resistant to most forms of kind of bombardment, especially against trebuchets. And you see that the way that the gateways of Vijayanagara are designed are very deliberately as these kind of L-shaped designs. So the enemy will have to turn and kind of navigate through barbicans and through various watchtowers in order to get into the main city itself, therefore potentially exposing themselves to archer fire on the way. And so the Vijayanagara elite, confident in their military power, began to invest primarily in temples. If you go to Hampi today, most of the temples that you see along the sacred center, along the southern bank of the Tungabhadra river, were highly expanded upon or even constructed for the first time over the course of this century. It was really, as far as Vijayanagara was concerned, a golden age. And you see Krishnadevaraya, arguably the most successful emperor that Vijayanagara has ever seen, kind of going out of his way, this grandson of a peasant, the son of a general, trying to recast himself as this ideal Indian king, especially through the patronage of poetry. He begins to write these remarkable texts such as the Amuktamalyada, which Srinivas mentioned earlier, which is a Telugu text written about a Tamil goddess Andal by a Tulu king ruling over an empire with a Karnataka heartland. And this is very deliberately, as you can see, a way for Krishnadevaraya to kind of appeal to the highly cosmopolitan elite that he found himself ruling over. In fact, he adopts a number of very high-sounding titles, the most interesting of which are, to my mind, Abhinava Bhoja, which means the new Bhoja, and Andhra Bhoja. This Bhoja being a 11th century king who ruled in Malwa, who was one of the great rivals of the Kalyana Chalukya king Someshwara, who you might recall from the very first episode of Yuddha that we ever did. And this Bhoja was one of the most extraordinary polymaths that ever lived in India, supposed to have had this gigantic library. He was a man who thought big, wanted to build a temple that would have been about as high as St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was built much, much later. He wrote grammars, treatises on astronomy, on architecture, really an extraordinary kind of guy. And he was such an accomplished poet that we are told in the courtyard of his tongue, the goddess Saraswati used to dance in ecstasy, which is really a symbol of like this high Sanskrit courtly culture that this 11th century king supposedly exemplified, and which Krishnadevaraya now went out of his way to kind of make sure that he exemplified as well. Once again, I'd like to kind of remind you who this man really is. Arguably coming from lowly origins, he has arisen to become one of the most powerful monarchs of the early modern period, who has brought his city to the absolute apogee of power, and who has deliberately gone around trying to erase his humble origins and present himself as the most modern and most remarkable man of his times. Given all these things, and especially given what followed, it's perhaps no surprise that Krishnadevaraya is remembered as the greatest and most ideal of all South Indian kings. As we've seen, he's really a far more complex character than that. And as we'll continue to see through this podcast, some of his military and strategic decisions, in particular his decision to focus on cavalry as the primary instrument of Vijayanagara power, would prove to be very, very ill-fated indeed.
Exactly. And while Krishnadevaraya's and his army were focusing on cavalry and increasing the strength of their cavalry, Bijapur had taken very different lessons from the Battle of Raichur and the siege of Raichur town itself. They invested in the decades that followed heavily in innovation around cannons. And while there isn't a great deal of literary evidence around it, there is evidence simply from the cannons themselves and from the works of Richard Eaton and Philip Wagner. And what their study of the cannons from the decades after 1520, after the Battle of Raichur, show us is that there are some really startling innovations going on. Now, let's remember that around 1520, most cannons that you would have seen in India were of the wrought iron kinds. And these would be cast out of wrought iron. They would be formed into two different sections. You would have iron bands actually bounding sections of the cannon together. So this did not necessarily make for the greatest structural integrity. You had to be very careful about not overloading cannons like these with a lot of gunpowder, which in turn limited their range. Now, these cannons also, in order to keep their pieces together, had to be placed on these very heavy, very immobile wooden carriages. So again, these were not very flexible weapons. Now, to change this, in order to create more flexible cannons where you can change the angle, where you can have lateral and horizontal movement, you would need to change really everything. You would need to change the cannons themselves. You'd need to change the way the cannons were mounted. And in terms of forts, you'd actually need to change architecture of forts themselves. And you do see that the Sultanates, but especially Bijapur, during the decades after 1520, really taking these lessons to heart. First, they learn the cast bronze technique of making cannons. Now, this was one of those technologies in which Europeans at this time did have an edge. They had, in fact, pioneered the use of cast bronze techniques for making church bells and adapted that to make these new types of cannons. Now, what a cast bronze cannon allowed you to do was to have a completely different mounting system, which you would call a trunnion. Now, trunnion is a term that we use in engineering even today, usually to refer block into which the barrel of any gun is mounted. Now, what it meant in terms of cannons of that time was this was basically a pivot or a brace around the cannon's barrel, which would allow it to be moved up and down, independent of the carriage on which the cannon was mounted. To this, the Bijapuris would add the swivel fork, which would allow the cannons to move sideways as well. So now you had cannons that could move sideways and up and down. So you could change the angle of the cannon fairly quickly to attack or hit a specific target. Now, in terms of siege warfare, it was no good just having such flexible cannons when you didn't actually design your forts in order to accommodate them. And so over here, you do see something very similar to what's happening in Europe. You see the creation of semicircular bastions protruding out of fort walls, which basically allow for what we would today call enfilading fire, where you are able to flank an enemy from one end and hit them. These semicircular bastions would allow these cannons to cover an arc of about 180 degrees or a semicircle. Now, there were also circular gun platforms which could be moved in a full circle or 360 degrees. So the Bijapuris were clearly innovating across the board with cannon manufacture, with the carriages for the cannons, as well as in military architecture of forts themselves. And so by the second half of the 16th century, the Bijapuris had very formidable defenses along their forts, and they also had mastered the ability to use these cannons very effectively on an open battlefield.
That's quite fascinating, Aditya. And what I find most interesting about this overall dynamic is how Vijayanagara basically continues to invest in a technology that's tried and tested, that's well proven, that by all logic should continue to maintain their dominance of Deccan battlefields. But what they don't understand is that a cavalry force can only be so effective. Once you make it reach 100% efficiency, there's no technological thing you can do to make horses go faster or to make armor lighter or to make your cavalrymen more effective. And what the Sultanates instead, who, because they were being kind of price gouged by the Portuguese and are basically being outbid in the cavalry markets by Vijayanagara, what the Sultanates did instead was kind of invest in a technology that could continuously be refined, that could continuously be made more and more effective, and managed to eventually do that with their cannons and managed to create an artillery force that was arguably among the most sophisticated in the world at the time.
Absolutely. There's no doubt it was one of the most sophisticated artillery forces on earth. And what's really fascinating to me was that this innovation was largely centered around Bijapur, though the other sultanates also incorporated some of its ideas. Now, on the one hand, it's tempting to think, well, the Vijayanagara army is just idiots. Well, they were not. Even in our time, when any new military innovation comes, it's really difficult to understand its implications. It's very difficult to understand the trajectory that the technology is going to take and what the tactical application is going to look like. And so, in periods or times of great military change, you do see otherwise highly competent armies suddenly finding themselves falling behind. The other thing that I find really interesting is I think that this innovation in cannon manufacture, in military architecture, does tell us something about Bijapur. This was obviously not just like any other kingdom. There was something dynamic about it. Now, this dynamism seems to have existed despite the fact that in the court of Bijapur, as well as the other sultanates, there was constant chaos, and chaos was often frequently violent. You had sultans being overthrown, you had coups, you had court intrigues, assassinations. At the high level, these courts were all typically snake pits, really. And yet below that, there does seem to be some degree of stability at an administrative level, at a fiscal level, at the level of commerce and openness to ideas and openness to bringing people from all over the world as well as from India together. Just consider the town of Bijapur itself, the capital of that sultanate. This was obviously a place that attracted people not just from all over the Bijapuri Sultanate, but all over from the Deccan, where you had this highly mobile elite of administrators, of soldiers, going between these sultanates as well as Vijayanagara. And just to describe the city, I'm going to quote something from the historian Abdul Ghani Imiratwale. And here's what he says, quote, "Within walls, the capital was overcrowded by the public buildings, palaces, military establishments like stables, quarters, magazines of gunpowder and other explosive, arms and ammunition, etc. Water towers, educational institutions, mints, government storehouses called ambar khanas, mosques, markets, sarais, tombs of Sufis and kings, khankas, gardens of fruits, big and small wells, arches, bastions, gates, etc." Unquote. This is the picture of a highly concentrated city, a highly urbanized area, teeming with people, teeming with life, teeming with ideas. And it is also a city that is heavily defended. There is an outer fort. The city is defended by cannons. And outside of those walls are actually extended suburbs that attest to the dynamism of Bijapur. The other point I want to make is we've talked about how Bijapur was able to attract engineers, for example, from Genoa or Naples. Now, this is obviously a sultanate that is not terribly religiously dogmatic, despite the fact that there are sectarian divides at the top between Shias and Sunnis. There is clear evidence, for example, that Hindus were not mistreated in this sultanate. And in fact, Hindus were very much part of the administrative infrastructure. You have especially Marathas and Brahmins who are very much integrated into the top bureaucracy. You have sultans marrying Maratha women. And in fact, the entire revenue and accounts departments of Bijapur were entirely dominated by Brahmins and Marathas. The Brahmins would keep the accounts and the Marathas would actually go out and get that revenue. You do also hear about the imposition of jizya, but on the ground, there's very little evidence that this tax was actually implemented, or that if it was implemented somewhere, that it really was an issue for anyone. So overall, it has to be said that Bijapur was obviously a very dynamic place, and it's not terribly surprising that you saw such amazing military innovation take place there.
I want to emphasize once again that both Bijapur and Vijayanagara are in this sense very, very alike. So just as Bijapur is going out of its way to make Hindus an integral part of its administrative apparatus, Vijayanagara at the same time is making Muslims an integral part of its military and political apparatus. In fact, one of the most interesting incidents that shows us how cross-cultural and cosmopolitan this Deccan elite could be at the time, and reinforcing what I said in my introduction to this episode, that it's really part of one kind of single courtly cosmopolitan culture, was what happened in the aftermath of Krishnadevaraya's death. Vijayanagara courtly politics, just like Bijapur's, was an absolute nest of vipers. And this eventually led to one of Krishnadevaraya's son-in-laws, a chap called Ramaraya, emerging as the dominant power of Vijayanagara. What Ramaraya did soon after coming to his throne was receive a massive number of Westerners or foreigners, probably Persians, who had been kicked out of the kingdom of Bijapur because the ruler then, Ibrahim Adil Shah, was a pro-Deccani. So this guy had kind of really revamped the administration to use far more Kannada and Marathi and Sanskrit, and was far closer to the indigenous factions of Indian Muslims who called themselves the Deccanis, and had basically prosecuted his Persian members of his court, who instead of fleeing back to their homelands, instead migrated south to Vijayanagara, where we are told one of the Ethiopian commanders of these nobles, a chap with the title of Ainul Mulk, was actually greeted by Ramaraya, the ruler of Vijayanagara, as his brother. We are also told quite remarkably that Ramaraya really kind of went out of his way to really woo these people. He supposedly gave out his entire space for them close to the royal center of the city, where there were a number of palaces for these important Muslim noblemen and commanders. This street was called the Turkwala Street. We are also told that Ramaraya continued a practice first instituted by Devaraya II, this long-forgotten king of Vijayanagara who we talked about 2 episodes ago, which basically meant that he would have a Quran set up in front of him, so Muslims who served him could bow down to the Quran, and in the process also maintain the courtly niceties of bowing to him as well without really breaking their religion. We are also told by a contemporary Bijapuri that Ramaraya's elder brother, along with a bunch of other nobles, supposedly demanded that he ban the Muslims from killing animals, at which point Ramaraya replied that these people have accepted your jobs, so do not make them quit or change their religion. They should not be troubled, and they will serve you sincerely and loyally. That's fascinating, and it's actually mirrored quite exactly by a later Bijapuri king who supposedly ordered that his court should stop the consumption of meat so as not to offend the sensibilities of his upper caste Brahmin and Jain advisors. So you see, really on both sides of the Krishna Tungabhadra Doab, even though very often the Deccan Sultanates and Vijayanagara kind of portrayed as these unchanging, absolutely hostile Muslim and Hindu powers, at best Vijayanagara perhaps is kind of portrayed as being foolishly secular, whereas Bijapur was far more interested in its intolerant religion. That's really not the case at all. They all make up very much part of the same kind of interactive and highly globalized, highly dynamic courtly culture. 2 other great examples from the reign of Ramaraya come from 2 men who would eventually rise to become sultans themselves. The first is a young man called Ibrahim, who was the son of the Sultan of Golconda. Now, Ibrahim supposedly did something either to piss his father off or was kind of hunted by his elder brother after his elder brother assassinated their father, and he requested that Ramaraya provide him with refuge. Ramaraya did this quite readily for 2 reasons. The first, of course, is that he saw potential in Ibrahim to eventually become a loyal vassal of his, ruling over Golconda, Telangana, where a large number of Telugu aristocrats were fairly friendly towards Vijayanagara because, as we talked about previously, Vijayanagara's military aristocracy was to a great extent composed of Telugus. The second reason was that Ramaraya had a personal stake in this. Earlier in his career, in fact, when he was still starting out as a military man, keep in mind, this man, who was in fact the son of one of the most famous Vijayanagara generals, Aravedi Bukka, who was one of the partners in crime of the former Emperor Salava Narasimha, and of course of the progenitor of the Tulva dynasty of Krishnadevaraya. This man, who was the son of one of Vijayanagara's most important generals, had served as the commander of a fort under the Golconda Sultanate. He supposedly did not really distinguish himself. He fled supposedly during an attack by the Bijapuris and was expelled from Golconda as a result. He perhaps had met Ibrahim already, or at the very least saw a way to kind of strike back at his former liege. So once again, you kind of see a man who was now ruling Vijayanagara, was at one point a military officer under one of the sultanates, and now sees an opportunity to establish a protege of his upon the throne of one of these sultanates, which Ramaraya does later. He supposedly granted an army of 30,000 cavalry under the command of his brother to Ibrahim, who eventually went back and took his throne back by force. Another instance of Ramaraya engaging in this sort of thing was soon after the accession of Ali Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur. This young man supposedly came to Vijayanagara with extremely rich gifts, supposedly 15,000 pieces of cloth, including quite remarkably a number of European stitched shirts, which seem to have been imported from the Portuguese, and was very lavishly treated by Ramaraya and was supposedly taken to meet Ramaraya's wife, who, as we recall, was the daughter of Krishnadevaraya, at which point she declared that Ali Adil Shah was like a son to her, kind of showing you how these terms of quote-unquote Hindu and Muslim don't really apply that well to the medieval Deccan, and which is really time that we stop seeing their relations through this binary. Now, Ali Ramaraya, over the next few decades, embarked on a remarkably daring policy with regards to the northern Deccan. We are not totally sure what really caused this. The historian Richard Eaton thinks that it was because Ramaraya had a need to kind of legitimize himself and therefore began to try and resurrect memories of a long-forgotten Deccan empire. In fact, an empire that we started this season of Yuddha with, namely the Kalyana Chalukyas. We see over the course of his reign, Ramaraya's relatives and he himself taking a number of titles that are directly connected to the Kalyana Chalukyas, including Chalukya Narayana, Chalukya Chakravarti, Emperor of the Chalukyas, and a number of other titles such as Lord of the City of Kalyana and so on and so forth. He also quite famously adopted the famous imperial boar banner of the Chalukyas as his own personal sigil, and this might very well have been because Ramaraya, like his predecessor Krishnadevaraya, saw himself as being so superior to the Deccan Sultans that he saw them as being nothing more than his vassals, and therefore to Ramaraya claiming control of the city of Kalyana, kind of preferentially allying with and manipulating various Deccan Sultans, especially Hussein Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur, and Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah of Golconda to fight over Kalyana and also to be his vassal, seems to have been a kind of driving force under his entire policy. Now, this of course is one interpretation of it. It could, of course, be that Mr. Eaton is totally wrong, and that instead Ali Ramaraya was interested merely in kind of keeping all these sultans at each other's throats while maintaining his control over a city that had a great deal of historical memory attached to it. This is not to say, of course, that Ali Ramaraya was the only kind of factor that was causing the Deccan Sultans to fight each other. These guys were very much capable of fighting with each other on their own account. In fact, there are a number of wars that break out between Ahmednagar, Bijapur and Golconda over various border forts, even without Ramaraya's intervention. And it really seems that this is kind of a resurrection of the ancient geopolitical patterns of the Deccan, particularly of the 12th centuries. In episodes 5 and 6 of this podcast, we talked a lot about the Delhi Sultanate's expeditions into the Deccan, and we talked about how the Sena Yadavas of Maharashtra were constantly at war with the Hoysalas of southern Karnataka, a fight that the Kakatiyas of Warangal sometimes entered into. Now, if you think about it, these sultanates basically reoccupy the same territories that these ancient powers once did. You have the Maratha-speaking regions dominated by Ahmednagar, you have the Kannada-speaking regions dominated by Bijapur and Vijayanagara, and you see the Telugu-speaking regions dominated by Golconda. So once again, you see this kind of tripartite geopolitical struggle re-emerging, and it kind of shows you that there are some things that really are eternal in terms of the way that the regions of the Indian subcontinent interact with each other. In general, Ramaraya proved to be a very remarkable player of this geopolitical game, but at one point he kind of overplayed his hand. Soon after humiliating Hussein Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, forcing the man to eat a betel leaf from his palm, which is a very ancient aspect of Indian courtly culture but was not well received by Hussein Nizam Shah at all. This was a campaign which once again incidentally was centered around the fort of Kalyana, the former capital of the Kalyana Chalukyas. Ramaraya, on one of these campaigns north, after defeating Hussein Nizam Shah, on his way back decided to kind of boss around and show his authority to relatively friendly sultanates, including Golconda and Bijapur. He supposedly ransacked a number of towns, let his soldiers basically run free, perhaps with the impression that as the dominant ruler of this region, he was not going to be challenged. It's also important to kind of understand this within the context of Ramaraya's politics. The reason why Ramaraya was able to embark on all these expeditions into the northern Deccan was because he had kind of upended Krishnadevaraya's old centralized way of ruling, which depended primarily on an army commanded by Brahmins, which was directly under the control of the Vijayanagara emperor. Instead, what Ramaraya did was kind of parcel out pieces of land to powerful Nayakas, which was something that had been consistent with Indian royal practice for centuries, but would eventually prove to be his undoing. In the short term, of course, these Kannada and Telugu chiefs were very, very happy indeed to join up with Ramaraya and all these expeditions. In fact, some of these Telugu chiefs who had relatives in Golconda seem to have kind of fomented a rebellion against Ibrahim Qutub Shah with Ramaraya's connivance. And it seems that Ramaraya was on the verge of overthrowing his own protege to take direct control of Golconda when Ibrahim Qutub Shah discovered the conspiracy and had the conspirators, who were mostly Telugu warrior chiefs, massacred wholesale. Either way, this policy that started off so daringly, that started off so well with Ramaraya dominating the Deccan, with Ramaraya gathering the recalcitrant Telugu and Kannada chiefs into his fold, as it were, and unleashing them against the sultans, would prove to be his undoing because of all the resentment that it kind of fomented among these proud sultans who had these remarkably militarily innovative armies in their own right. And this would lead quite directly to the battle with which we started this episode, possibly one of the most pivotal and important battles of all of Indian history, if not all of global history, the Battle of Talikota in 1565.
It's interesting to picture this rather unlikely coalition of sultans heading out to really deliver this devastating blow to Vijayanagara. These are sultans who have forever battled each other, who do not trust each other for a moment. They've been brought together into this uneasy coalition or alliance just because they believe they need to take out Vijayanagara, or at least teach Ramaraya a lesson, perhaps kill him. Anirudh has already talked about the travails of Hussain Nizam Shah. You can imagine by this time this man was absolutely thirsting for vengeance. He definitely wanted to actually kill Ramaraya. And so then these men lead their armies with their field artillery and head right across the Krishna River looking for a battle. It's also really interesting that at this time, they're still very much open to and to an extent dependent on foreign expertise. They rely to a great extent on a captain named Rumi Khan. As that name might suggest, Rumi simply means really Roman, which refers to somebody coming from Anatolia, what is today country of Turkey. So, they were very much open to this foreign expertise. You had foreign experts. You had these very Indian sultans at the same time. If you look at portraits of all of these men, they all have the bronze skin tone, typical of the Deccan. Some of them are pictured holding a scroll or maybe a flower, but almost all of them are always armed. So these were very much also men of war.
And so our brave warriors headed south towards the Krishna River. And as you can imagine, Ramaraya has plenty of informants, plenty of loyalists, both Hindu, Muslim, Indian and foreign in all of these courts. And so immediately realizes that a denouement, a climax is beginning to brew. He immediately summons troops from far across the empire, from distant chieftains, including the Nayaka of Madurai, a chap called Krishnappa, who had sent his minister, Aryanatha Mudlayar, with a very large force. This massive Vijayanagara army would have been composed of contingents from Ikkeri in northern Karnataka. It would have been composed perhaps of contingents from Mysore, from Vijayanagara itself, from the areas constituting modern Bangalore, from Kannada, and from the Tamil country. So really an extraordinarily multi-ethnic force, very diverse, with Muslim artillerymen, with Portuguese gunners, and began to advance towards the Krishna River. Ramaraya would have known very well that this was where his royal fortune would be arbitered. By this point of time, the man was nearly 80 years old, if not older, and he knew that one final decisive battle would cement him as the greatest of all Vijayanagara emperors, the equal, if not even greater than his father-in-law Krishnadevaraya. But as we'll see, the bets that the Vijayanagara elite had made over the last few decades because of the success of Krishnadevaraya, particularly in cavalry and not in artillery, would prove to be their undoing on this fateful day, the 23rd of January, 1565. The battle began properly on the night before the 23rd, on the 22nd, roughly at 11 p.m. On this Oxbow Bend in the Krishna River, where earlier Ramaraya had set up camp. The sultans crossed over in the dead of night, roughly around 11 p.m. Bijapuri eyewitnesses tell us that Ramaraya's camp was too busy partying to actually take notice. This might or might not be the case. We really have no idea. But it does not seem that the fight proper really began began until midday the next day, which would not really have been the case if the crossing had happened so early. It kind of seems unlikely that Vijayanagara troops would not have contested it. Either way, by roughly 12 the next day, the armies had been deployed. Broadly, the Sultan's battle plan was as follows. The most fearsome and vindictive enemy of Ramaraya, Hussein Nizam Shah, was commanding in the center. He had most of the coalition's artillery with him. Ali Adil Shah, the man who had been acclaimed as Ramaraya's wife's own son, had taken his troops a little distance down the river and was basically now deployed along the Vijayanagara left flank. The left flank of the Sultans, meanwhile, was commanded by a coalition consisting of Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah with some contingents from the Sultan of Bida. Ramaraya supposedly went into battle with high confidence. He declared that there'd be a massive reward of gold for any man who brought him Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah or Ali Adil Shah. He would have them put in cages and live out the rest of their days like animals, whereas Hussein Nizam Shah was to be captured and beheaded immediately. We can imagine that similar exhortations were being made on the other side. Specifically in the center, as Hussein Nizam Shah with 100 military eunuch bodyguards gave the order for the general advance. The battle lasted a few hours, and it seems to really have been a very, very close run thing. Ali Adil Shah's attempt to encircle Vijayanagara was for the longest time unsuccessful. He was directly opposed by a brother of Ramaraya's, and it was only much later in the day that he eventually began to gain the upper hand and began to break through into the Vijayanagara rear. However, a few kilometers away, Hussein Nizam Shah was commanding the center. He had no idea that this was happening, and he was beginning to ponder a retreat, at which point the Vijayanagara forces, we are told, managed to break through his center and found themselves face to face with the artillery that he had brought to the battlefield. This was where, for the first time, gunpowder would be deployed to the most devastating effect on an Indian battlefield, and would establish forever that the age of gunpowder was here to stay. The Turkish military officer Rumi Khan had ordered that the cannons be loaded with small copper coins and gunpowder, and at point blank range, as Vijayanagara infantry began to advance towards the Sultanate center, they were fired at in devastating volleys of what 18th century Europeans would call grape shot. These small shrapnels of copper coin, we are told, absolutely shredded the flesh of the Vijayanagara infantry. In the course of just a few minutes, we are told that over 5,000 Vijayanagara troops died. The center immediately began to crumble. Soon after that, the Vijayanagara flanks on both sides began to be pushed quite aggressively. Sultanate cavalry force somehow managed to get quite deep in behind the lines, where Ramaraya was commanding, managed to capture him on an elephant and bring him to the other side of the battlefield to Hussein Nizam Shah. Now, Hussein Nizam Shah tried to replicate the quote-unquote cordiality that Ramaraya had shown to him all those years ago when Ramaraya had invaded his capital and forced him to eat beetle from his hand. He supposedly asked Ramaraya how his health was, at which point the 80-year-old man simply gestured to his head, indicating that he knew that his fate had come. At this point, we are told that an Ahmednagari noble was furious that the Raya was still so composed, and basically told Hussein Nizam Shah that, look, Ali Adil Shah has broken into the rear of the Vijayanagara forces. He is a man who considers the Raya to be his own father. If he comes here, the Raya will survive, so allow me to kill him immediately. At which point Hussein Nizam Shah agreed. Ramaraya was beheaded. His head was put on a spear and brought out to the forefront of the battle. Vijayanagara's army, which, as you recall, was no longer this centralized force, but rather a much more spread out and decentralized army composed of contingents from many Nayakas. As soon as they saw the head of Ramaraya began to flee from the battlefield, his brother Tirumala went back to the city of Vijayanagara, ordered a general evacuation, because he knew that the fortifications of Vijayanagara, which were designed for cavalry, were not going to be able to hold up against artillery. He supposedly evacuated nearly 100 million pounds worth of wealth with him. Hundreds of thousands of people began to flee the city. Some of the Nayakas and Polygars of Vijayanagara supposedly also sacked a little bit of the city, because in the total chaos and pandemonium that began to ensue. And after 3 weeks of dividing up the spoils of Ramaraya's camp and soaking in the extraordinary fact that for the first time in nearly 200 years since the foundation of the Sultanates and the foundation of Vijayanagara, for the first time one side had suffered a decisive defeat, the sultans slowly began to advance towards Vijayanagara to begin the creation of a brave new world.
The Battle of Talikota is so fascinating, not just because of how it fundamentally changed the history of the subcontinent, but also, like you've illustrated, Anirudh, it is a landmark in military innovation and the application of new military technology on the subcontinent. And this technology was applied in a way that was very similar to, for example, the way it was used in Europe. It's important to, I think, see the Battle of Talikota in terms of this military innovation and in terms of its military causes, and to not necessarily try and draw some political meaning from it using our modern lenses. For instance, a lot of the conversation around the Battle of Talikota revolves around these two Muslim commanders, the so-called Gilani brothers, and how they defected. Now, the truth is that we don't even know if this actually happened. We don't have a primary source that definitively tells us this happened. And also, it's not clear that even if such a thing did happen, at what point in the battle it occurred, and whether it was really all that important. What I think is absolutely critical is the devastation of the Vijayanagara army using superior firepower. And instead of trying to impose our modern political views or our current preoccupations over this battle, it's important to understand that these were a series of regional states that were fighting for primacy, were fighting for dominance, were pursuing ambitions, and were doing so ruthlessly in the nature of the times themselves. And I think that the triumph of these sultanates actually attests to the dynamism of military innovation in India.
The success of this military innovation can be seen in the fact that none of the Vijayanagara commanders even seem to have given a moment's thought to actually defending the city. They knew perfectly well that the fortifications that they themselves had been neglecting in favor of building irrigation works and temples was simply not up to the task of fighting off this kind of artillery. And which is why when the sultans arrived at the gates of Vijayanagara a few weeks later, they found this magnificent metropolis to be almost totally empty. Now, at this point, we are told by a lot of historians, especially, for example, Nilakanta Shastri and Krishnaswamy Iyengar, that the sultans embarked on basically this orgy of rape, plunder, destruction. Historians like Robert Sewell, the British historian, have basically written about this like it was the end of any hope of, like, quote-unquote Hindu empire in India, and represented the absolute triumph of Islam. As we've seen over the course of the last 3 episodes, that really wasn't the case. Identities were far more complex than this British binary would like us to believe. And one thing that I find endlessly surprising is, even though British theories such as the Aryan invasion theory, which I won't get into right now, are correctly dismissed as having originated from frankly racist imperial historiographies, the history of Vijayanagara and the fall of Vijayanagara, especially the idea that Vijayanagara originated to fight Muslims and ended fighting Muslims, was, even though this was a myth that was created by the British to kind of amplify the brutality of Muslim political rule in the subcontinent, therefore kind of present themselves and the horrors of their rule in a good light, somehow this British myth is totally swallowed up wholesale. Luckily, we now have primary evidence that enables us to look beyond this binary lens and actually understand what went down in Vijayanagara in those crucial months in 1565. And the picture that emerges is really very different from what the literary sources would like us to believe. Even though Muslim sources claim that they razed an area of 20 square miles, if you look at the ruins of Vijayanagara today, Hampi, you'll see that from an archaeological point of view, as the archaeologist Kathleen Morrison, who at one point led the Vijayanagara Metropolitan Survey, says, they're archaeologically in remarkably good condition. There are only very few sites where destruction actually happened. Loot was almost definitely extremely widespread. If there had been any inhabitants, knowing how medieval armies were, we can expect that there would have been some pretty horrifying examples of physical and sexual violence. But in terms of destruction, examples are really very few and far between. We know from analysis of the granite that was used in various buildings and the way that exfoliation patterns happened on them and the way that charcoal is layered on them, we can really build a fairly good picture of what the sultans actually did in Vijayanagara. And the picture that it reveals is quite fascinating. The royal center appears to have been the primary target of violence from the sultans. The Mahanavami Dibba, which I talked about earlier, which was the center of Vijayanagara Vijayanagara royal ritual, a very public space where the Vijayanagara kings kind of reinforced their relationships with the empire and the people at large, and which had a great wooden superstructure on top of it, was burnt. Being made of wood, this superstructure did not really last very long. It burned and slowly collapsed down the southern side of the Dibba, which would have been a truly horrifying sight to anybody who would have been there to watch it. The Sultan's troops were then dispatched into the urban core of the city, where you had a number of noblemen's palaces, including perhaps the Turkwala Street. A number of those palaces there were burnt to the ground, absolutely sacked. And in rains that came later on in the year, all this charcoal was gathered up in little rivulets and basically caked the underground Shiva temple that you see today, which was then known as the Prasanna Virupaksha Temple. The Prasanna Virupaksha Temple itself, which was one of the original temples of the Sangama dynasty that founded Vijayanagara, was actually not attacked at all. Neither was the Hazara Rama or Ramachandra Temple, where Krishnadevaraya had decorated the mandapa with pillars that he seized from Orissa. Also survives in remarkably good condition and was not vandalized at all. On the other hand, temples that were associated with the Tuluva dynasty that Krishnadevaraya was a part of, namely the Vithala temple and the Thiruvengalanatha temple, also known as the Achyutaraya temple, were subject to some pretty horrifying acts of deliberate desecration, which kind of shows you how much the armies of the Sultanates, which again, keep in mind, would have had a large number of Hindus, knew about theology and metaphysics of Vijayanagara's temples. These extraordinary constructs were loaded with wood and grass and straw that would have been gathered from wherever. And all this was kind of lined along the temple's central axis. So within the sanctum sanctorum and just outside, namely the line of sight of the god, that at least according to Hindu metaphysics would have been the axis upon which the god looked out and saw the city and saw his worshippers, that would have been covered with this flammable material then set on fire. Thus very deliberately kind of desecrating the sacred power of the temple and of the god. But as noted once again, you don't see this orgy of blood and destruction. You see a specific targeted destruction of monuments associated with a particular kind of royal power. On the one hand, the famous Lakshmi Narasimha statue, which has recently been restored, was brutally kind of hacked into pieces and set on fire. On the other hand, a Ganesha statue, which is quite close to it, was not touched at all. And there's all kinds of examples of this. You see many gateways connected to the royal center being deliberately defaced, but much of their surroundings being left in quite remarkably good condition. In fact, arguably the most important and grandest of all Vijayanagara temples, the Virupaksha Temple, is still active today with almost no evidence of ever having been attacked by the Sultanates. And the broader Vijayanagara metropolitan region itself, where all these people, the cultivators that fed the great city, lived, doesn't seem to have seen any kind of systematic depopulation. They continue to live in the region. In fact, a large number of them actually seem to have moved into the city of Vijayanagara, especially its fertile irrigated canal system, which was built at such great expense by these emperors, was taken over and kind of occupied by these peasants. As far as the people of the broader region were concerned, they seem to have understood the Sultanates very much as being part of the kind of political world of the elites that they inhabited. When Ali Adil Shah reached Anegondi, which is a Vijayanagara citadel on the north bank of the Tungabhadra river, they supposedly received assurances from him that he would protect them and take care of them, and as a result opened up the gates of the citadel to him and let him in. So as you can see, really, what we call the fall of Vijayanagara is not really the collapse of the empire, but really the end of the great metropolis from which the Rayas once ruled. In fact, the family of Ramaraya moved away to the citadel of Penukonda, where they established a new ruling dynasty of Vijayanagara, the Aravidus, and these guys actually turned out to be the longest lasting of all Vijayanagara imperial dynasties, lasting for over 100 years. Though for most of these 100 years, they were the pathetic pawns, as Bertenstein puts it, of the great Telugu imperial houses, the various Nayakas, including the Nayakas of Ikkeri, of Chitradurga, the Wadiyars of Mysore, who now began to form their own kingdom, the rulers of Bangalore, the Madurai Nayakas, the Tanjore Nayakas, and the many, many other dynamic new Nayaka kingdoms that were beginning to form in southern India. So this is not really the end of Hindu rule as many historians try to make it out to be. It is not really an example of a foolishly tolerant or over-ambitious quote quote-unquote Hindu empire being destroyed by fanatical and treacherous Muslims, as some others make it out to be. It's a remarkable story of intertwined destinies of early modern states who are taking influences from as far away as China and Europe, who are interacting with the world of the Indian Ocean, and who are trying desperately to contend with their own personal geopolitics, with their own tragic politics of their ruling dynasties, which end with the victory of perhaps the most remarkable underdogs in all of Indian history, the Deccan Sultanates.
While Vijayanagara faced retrenchment and decline, the Deccan Sultanates faced a more uncertain future. In the years immediately after Talikota, they eyed each other warily. Then, in 1571, Bijapur and Ahmednagar joined a coalition of states that tried to push out the Portuguese from India. While they failed, it was the beginning of an understanding between the two sultanates. In the years that followed, Bijapur advanced southwards into the power vacuum left behind by Vijayanagara's defeat, confident enough that there would be no serious trouble along its northern border with Ahmednagar. The Golconda Sultanate also expanded south. Soon these kingdoms would prosper. Bijapur, that still thriving city of victory, would see an explosion of sublime architecture in the Deccanese style. And merchants from all over the world would flock to this metropolis.
Ahmednagar would not be as lucky. A new power was rising in the Gangetic Plains, a gunpowder-wielding global empire as revolutionary as its Deccan contemporaries. Roughly the same time as Krishnadevaraya had embarked on his brilliant career, a young Central Asian prince who claimed descent from the fearsome conquerors Timur and Chinggis Khan had traversed the icy passes of Afghanistan with a small band of followers. His name was Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, and his descendants, whom we call the Mughals, would once again restore to Delhi the violent primacy it had once held over the rest of the subcontinent. But in the late 16th century, the forces that would bring the Mughals to their knees eventually were already rising in the Deccan, brilliant cavalrymen called the Marathas.
Over the course of this season of Yuddha, we've come a long way. We began with the doughty infantrymen who speared their way to glory in southern India, and the warriors who sailed on ships of war to Southeast Asia. We've considered the world of the Turks, nomads and slaves who forged their own empire in India's Great Plains. We've seen how the descendants of those Turks shattered the polities of the Deccan, changing it forever, and leading to the creation of the great cities of victory, Vijayanagara and Bijapur. We've also seen how the Portuguese came to India's west coast, and how these great cities of victory clashed in a drama filled with glory and tragedy.
To tell a history, any history, is a grand and intoxicating innocence, an attempt to tell the story of how our world came to be with the precious few fragments that survive from our past. We hope that this season has helped you realize just what a vibrant and violent world our societies grew out of. In the next season, the stories of India's geopolitical regions will clash with the rising power of Europe. We will meet such personalities as Martanda Varma of Kerala, Ahmed Shah Durrani of Afghanistan, and of course, Shivaji Bhonsle, the extraordinary ruler of the Marathas. We'll see Indian powers fight Europeans on equal terms, great imperial cities being sacked, empires being brought to their knees by a determined few, empires being made by foreigners with blood and fire and gunpowder. Thank you so much for participating in our project to understand India as it is. We'll see you a few months from now in our second season.
Before we begin our next season, let us know what you thought of this season of Yuddha, what you liked best or disliked most. We'd also love to hear what you think we should cover in the next season, and also whether there are any special episodes you'd like us to do. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
If you like Yuddha, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast app.
Yuddha is made possible by support from the Takshashila Institution and the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation. And your goodwill makes it possible for us to keep going.
If there's anything you'd like to learn about India's vibrant, violent military history, reach out to us on Twitter or Instagram. I'm Anirudh Kanesetti, that's ANIRUDH KANISETTI.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan, that's ADITYA RAMANATHAN. And while you're at it, don't forget to check out other interesting shows on the IVM Podcast Network.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel. It's been a great week on the network this week. If you haven't been paying attention, please do listen to some of the shows. We had Chetan Bhagat. This was the first returning guest on Cyrus Says. Do check that out. Great episode. We had Palak Zatakia on Advertising is Dead. Really interesting conversation was had with Varun. We had another crossover on the habit codes. Zarina Poonawala showed up over there to have a discussion with Ashton about anxiety and pressure. Begin the Journey with Ashir Vidyarthi continues to kill it. Please definitely do check it out. An old friend, Vijay Koshi, was on Storytellers and Storysellers. Do check that out as well. And I'd like to mention one thing. If you're a Tamil speaker, you should definitely check out our podcast, Kadai Podcast Punyan Selvan. Kavita Jiva has done a fantastic job to finish up her first story. It is the last episode which just came out last Monday. Do check it out if you speak Tamil. It is an incredible achievement. Please do check that out. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Paisa, a show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Paisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.